My guest is Edward Dodge. He's returning for a second appearance. Ed, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Nate. Hey Hart, it's great to be here. And yeah, my name's Ed Dodge. I am a I work in renewable energy. I've been studying and working in this space for a long time. So currently, I build commercial scale, megawatt scale, solar, battery storage, and microgrid projects all over the country. So I'm in the commercial side of the solar power business, and we are actively rolling out projects all over the place. And my perspective on all of this is that as much as I benefit from electrification and I'm happy to do it, I support all of these technologies and I'm literally making my living from it. I recognize the limitations on it. I recognize the limitations of what's being pitched politically. Basically, the left wing zeitgeist, the environmental, the zeitgeist of the movement, the intellectual zeitgeist, where everybody's at right now, is at this the idea that we're going to ban all fossil fuels, eliminate all fossil fuels, at least to the extent possible. Ideally, they would have it go to zero, and electrify everything. And that has become the standard answer for how we're going to address climate change. So they say, that carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning is causing global warming. Global warming is causing instability of weather. Therefore, we need to install more solar panels and wind turbines, and that'll, in theory, prevent bad weather from happening in the future, apparently. I don't really buy it. I don't really buy that industrial policy is going to save our ecology. I think we need to be putting ecology first, and industrial policy should be coming second. And I think that our industrial policy should be modeled around nature and modeled to mimic nature and work with nature as much as possible. And that means zero waste economics, circular economics, and working towards zero pollution. Nature has endless growth, and it does it through circular economics, so to speak, because every output feeds the next input, and there's no waste and there's no pollution. Whereas our industrial model right now is a linear economic model where we dig resources out of the ground, use them once, and then dump them just wherever they end up, in the air, in a landfill, in the rivers, wherever the stuff ends up. And then we're shocked that we have, holes in the ground over on our right and big piles of pollution to our left. But that's exactly what our system is designed to do. And swapping out fossil fuels for solar and battery systems, if we're still going to use the same kind of economic mindset, is just going to be repeating the same exercise of digging holes in the ground to create pollution. We're trading one earth raping industry for another earth raping industry, because by the time you scale out these electrification solutions, sure, they don't produce, air emissions, but there's no free lunch here. We don't get this stuff doesn't come, gift wrapped. All these resources come from someplace. And so all this electrification requires a massive input of mineral resources, so much copper, so much lithium, cobalt, nickel, you name it. It's like so many mineral resources that as you scale it out, the numbers just become mind-boggling. And we really we'll never really get there. And then we have land use limitations on wind and solar. We don't build new hydropower because we ran out of spots a long time ago for good hydropower, even though hydropower is by far the best renewable energy. And we're going to have the same thing with wind and solar. The big wind sites will get saturated, and then the industry will be capped out. And the same thing will be true for the mega size solar projects. Not so much the small size solar. We can keep doing small solar forever. We're not going to run out of space for that. But the mega size projects, the 100 megawatts and up projects that are, a square mile and more, those projects are going to saturate. There simply will be a limit on how much land use. I mean, land use is finite just by definition, but there's going to be a limit on society. Society is going to have a pushback. We see it already. People resist these projects politically all over the country. They don't want wind turbines in their neighborhood, and for good reason. I wouldn't want to live less than a mile from a wind turbine either. And I support the wind industry. I think the wind industry is great, but I wouldn't want to be less than a mile from one of those things. And you definitely would not want to be downwind from one of those things, because they create real problems. They create a wake, a current in the wind, in the air, the same thing as a boat does. And so if your house is laying in the wind wake, so to speak, it can, which is like if you're less, a mile downwind, so you're caught in this sort of vertex of currents, it causes health problems. People get all these weird phantom health issues, these sort of intermittent things, it comes and it goes, and it's all sort of, weird air pressure kind of things that, to me, I think is just, it's a function of these weird, crazy air currents. And then we know that, if you're in a flickering shadow from the sunlight, like you're in a shadow of a wind turbine coming over your house, that's a problem. It's like that. They've already long since banned that, because when the wind industry rolled out at first, they were doing a lot of that. They were building turbines way too close to people's houses, causing these shadow problems, which would like drive people completely batty. Like it's like having a strobe light in your living room, it would drive them crazy. So they stopped doing that, but only because they regulated it, forced the industry to not do it. And, the same thing's true for solar. People resist these big solar projects because they're just oversized in a bad, my job is to place solar projects. Like that's what I spend my days doing, like siting spots and, checking out spots, and they've got to be appropriately sited. Not everything is a good spot for solar. And so, and the good spots will all be taken someday. And then like, that'll be that, and we won't keep growing it. And when these things saturate, there's gonna be a building boom for 20 years or whatever, which I'm like trying to take full advantage of in my career. And then once it's all saturated, it's not going to really grow substantially past that. And in my prediction, the net aggregate amount of power we're getting out of all that wind and solar, once it's all installed, will be way short of the targets that are needed to, completely convert everything to electricity, much less the additional load that we're putting on the power grid by taking transportation and moving it over to the electrical grid, and then taking all of our heating and moving it over to the electrical grid. When you take things from the fossil fuels and plug them into the grid, well, that electricity still got to come from someplace. So they want to simultaneously take off the old power plants, the old dirty coal plants, and I'm all for it, take them down. But you want to reduce supply of electricity and increase demand and do it all with wind and solar. It just doesn't make sense, which is why people advocate for nuclear power, which is fine. But nuclear is not going anywhere in the near term. It's a whole separate conversation about nuclear, but it's completely kind of like gummed up in the works right now in terms of like getting things through regulatory approval and getting the economics to crunch. And they're busy closing nuclear plants, not opening up new ones, except for that new one in Georgia is starting to come online, but they've been building it forever, and it's massively over budget and massively behind schedule, and it's not like a business success. So anyway, I'm a big advocate for clean fuels. I've been rambling here for a second. I really think that since it's not technically possible to electrify everything, we need to take the wins that we can get. We have natural gas is good. Methane is our friend. Methane is non-toxic, it's totally renewable. Everybody gives natural gas a bad rap as a greenhouse gas, which it is a greenhouse gas, but it's also a non-toxic, totally unlimited replacement for coal and oil across the board. We actually have the resources of natural gas. There's the quantities available, and it is a drop-in replacement today to replace diesel fuel, to replace, we're already replacing coal in the power grid, but we can use it in transportation as well. And you can either use natural gas directly in trucks, which they're doing now, or you make synthetic liquid fuels from it. Make methanol, DME, and any number of other downstream synthetic fuels that we can use today, that are already proven. We could be using DME, which is a synthetic propane, as a replacement for diesel fuel today, but it's not really on the market because they use it in Asia, but we're not using it here because, frankly, no one's building any engines is why. All right, we can, if you got a question.
Okay, so let's talk about the articles. There's 2 articles or more that you brought, and I looked them over. Tell me about the articles. There's one called Pollution. A recent poll reveals how tough it is to get an accurate read on public opinion about climate policy by Emily Atkin. What did you want to point out about that article?
Yeah, so Emily Atkin writes a Substack blog. I've never interacted with her. I think she does fine work, and I think she's a very committed journalist and has been working very hard on her Substack. But she is has very sort of these very conventional views, as I was mentioning before. She's like right in the middle of the mainstream on environmental policy. Her views are very conventional. My views would not be conventional. And so she is a zero fossil fuel person. Her entire like worldview is that we have to electrify everything and do zero fossil fuels. And so her current, this article, I picked this one just because it came out today, so it was on my mind. This one was posted today, and she was talking about a poll that came out where they were asking people which would they prefer: a fast rollout of renewable power, so like a fast build out of wind and solar, or should we slow down wind and solar to preserve nature? And the poll result for overwhelmingly was like 80%, 20% or something. 4-to-1 results that were overwhelmingly in favor of a go slow approach on renewable development and preserving nature as much as possible. And she was quite shocked by this. She was quite chagrined that this was a result of the poll and felt that people were really misinformed. Yeah.
So let me just read the exact words that
Okay.
that this poll posed to people. Heat map asked 500 Americans to choose between two statements. Number one, we should roll out renewable energy slowly to ensure natural or wild animals aren't harmed, even if it means taking longer to reduce greenhouse gas producing emissions. Or, second choice is we should roll out renewable energy quickly to lower emissions as fast as possible, even if that means harming natural or wild animals. So they got into the weeds about how the question was phrased, and that's fine. That the question as phrased is worthy of critique. It might not be phrased the very best, but I think the more interesting thing to me is what I consider to be false premises embedded in each question. Another thing that was interesting to me is that another valid critique of this poll is that they lump a bunch of issues together up here and a bunch of issues together down here. And it's like, if you really wanted to know how people think, then you would separate those out into different questions.
So what do you see being lumped together in the first one?
Well, you could say it's a loaded question. You could say that this is the type of question that the fossil fuel industry would put out there so as to get the result they're looking for, which is let's go slow on so-called renewable energy.
And that was basically what she was saying. That was basically the thrust of her article was exactly that point.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's a fair critique. Polls are tricky, and yeah, you can definitely weight questions in a certain way to drive results. I'm not disputing that. I tell you, I would have answered to roll out slowly and not be. Well, I know actually how difficult it is to get projects cited. That actually it is actually, there's a lot of environmental work on just to meet minimal building codes. So this assumes you have, minimal building codes. Like in America, we've got pretty stringent building codes, even anywhere in the country. And so there is going to be stormwater reviews, and there's a certain amount of environmental review that goes into every project already. So it's not like there isn't any, and that people are just going crazy, tearing up forests and stuff. But you might be surprised how much people are clear cutting, 50 acres at a time and and a couple hundred acres at a time. It's actually really common. And to me, it's a matter of a philosophical point that we don't value wild ecosystems economically. There is no place in any of our economic models that a piece of land that has an intact ecosystem is given any kind of financial reward whatsoever, or any benefit to the landowner or property steward, whoever is responsible for that land. In fact, you're penalized for having property. If you own just a piece of land, you have to pay property taxes on that land just for the privilege of holding it. And so at a minimum, people are incentivized to extract resources from the land at a minimum just to pay the property taxes. And throughout American history, we've actually had policies a lot stronger than that positively required people to clear cut forests and make farms. You know, when they were doing land grants back in the day, all throughout the 1800s, 1900s, you know, they would require people to clear cut trees. So we have really, you know, made a point of devastating our ecosystems as a matter of policy in America ever since, you know, the Europeans arrived. Yeah.
So let me quote the Emily Atkin article. It says, Senator Brian Schatz, Democrat, Hawaii, was one of the first to raise questions about the poll, saying he didn't believe it was accurate to force people to choose between harming wildlife and building renewables quickly. He says it's a false choice. He told Drilled and Heated in a statement. Drilled and Heated are both publications. He told Drilled and Heated in a statement, moving faster to literally save lives by preventing catastrophic drought, wildfires, sea level rise does not mean we are harming animals or the land. We can and should protect our environment and move with the urgency the climate crisis demands. So what I consider to be a false premise there is a couple of things. One is that carbon dioxide is causing drought and wildfires and sea level rise.
Right.
The other thing is that solar and wind will put a dent in carbon dioxide. I don't think that we're going to decarbonize the economy or the energy system by installing solar and wind, especially when we have a growing economy and we have no limits to what industry can do.
Yeah, 100%. Wind and solar are totally additive to our, there's no evidence that they've been replacing anything. They've been completely additive to our economy. And demand for electricity simply keeps growing. We keep adding data centers for Netflix and Facebook, what have you. So our demand for electricity is just through the roof. Although the statistics, I mean, you know, on the charts, you know, it goes like this. So like on any given year, they might say, oh, we didn't grow this year, but really, I mean, when you zoom back at the long-term trends, all the trend lines are up. I actually thought that guy's quote was hilarious because when I read that exact quote you just quoted, when I first read this, I started laughing because he's basically making the argument that implicit in that argument is that if we install a lot of wind turbines and solar panels, we're not going to have sea level rise or bad weather in the future, which is like, there's no connection there. There's no connection whatsoever between all this industrial policy and what kind of weather outcomes we're going to have. It's a possible correlation to make. And yet these kinds of things are taken at face value as quote unquote science. But really it's a distortion of science, if you ask me, or there's just different ways of looking at the science.
So we're sitting here and we have the nerve to say that maybe carbon dioxide is not the main thing causing change of weather. And I would agree with that. I think carbon dioxide is a serious problem because until I find out otherwise, I'm going to assume that acidification of the oceans is a serious problem. I think it is one of the most serious environmental problems we face. And that is a reason to want to lower the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. But as far as what is heating up the climate, I think it's primarily desertification and urban heat domes and agricultural heat domes and water as a greenhouse gas. But it's what we are doing to the land. It's removing ecosystems.
Yeah,
Ecosystems have a regulating effect. When water is flowing through an ecosystem, that means that water is present in that space. Take away the ecosystem, you take away the water. But if the ecosystem is there, you have plants, about 80 or 90% of the sun's energy is not used for photosynthesis. It is used for plant transpiration, which has a cooling effect. Plus, if you're concerned about carbon, or if you're concerned about carbon, you want ecosystems to be absorbing the carbon dioxide. And that to me is just, it is so, you would never even know that's an issue in 100 years of reading what I call the climate journalists, the
Yeah,
mainstream
exactly.
climate
I'm
movement.
100% with you. It's like the way I see the carbon problem is that it's 50% about land use. 50% of 50% of the carbon that's going in the air is the stuff we're burning, but 50% of it is our bad land use policies, bad agricultural policies, because people weren't aware. Deforestation, north and south, hemisphere. And so we have lost in America in a couple hundred years, we have lost, inches and inches of topsoil. A lot of that has gone into the atmosphere, and that adds up to gigatons and gigatons and gigatons of carbon that we can put back down into the ground if we got clever about actively restoring topsoils through regenerative agricultural practices that really are, we got to science the heck out of it to make them scale, and figure out how do we get to the next revolution in agriculture where we, without sacrificing the yields we've achieved in recent decades, learn to put the carbon back in the soil. And I think that's where going to be where the answer is, and restore the soil.
So I was just reading today, rereading a book called Growing a Revolution by David Montgomery. I've interviewed him. I interviewed him primarily about another book of his called What Your Food Ate, which is about the soil and the animals and the plants and the relationship with how nutrition and nutrients flows through all of those. But the book Growing a Revolution is a major theme in that, that he supports with abundant evidence, is that switching to organic and regenerative does not mean you're producing less food or less nutrition. In fact, organic and regenerative can definitely compete with industrial agriculture as far as how much food is produced and how much nutrition is produced. It may be, I mean, it's probably true. When you think of yield, farmers have been endlessly manipulated into maximizing the yield, but yield has very little to do with how much food is produced or how much nutrition is produced. And that's just from the standpoint of the farmer's profit, let alone all of these impacts that agriculture has. And like you were saying, when we lose topsoil, and when topsoil goes into the waterways because of all the erosion, then any carbon that was in the soil oxidizes and goes into the atmosphere. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is not talking about this with any regularity. They have it written in there just so they can say it's in there, but it's not being talked about.
Because politically speaking, the fossil fuel companies are the convenient bad guy, and farmers are not a convenient bad guy. It's not cool or sexy or going to get a lot of political support to go running around saying farmers are doing bad. It's a lot easier to go say those evil oil companies are doing bad because they're a much more obvious target. Because they do some crimes, but I mean, some of these guys are real criminals. And so, but the politics of it has always been to blame the fossil fuel industry and leave the land use aside. And also, they don't want to give the fossil fuel industries an out. That's why they're also very reticent about, natural soil carbon capture. A, the science is very complicated, but B, like they really want to put these companies out of business. And so the idea that you would give them a reasonable means to stay in business is not part of the political program today, which is unfortunate.
Let me read another. I'm now reading from an article by Robinson Meyer, March 23rd, entitled "Protecting Nature is More Important Than Quickly Building Renewables, Most Americans Say." The subtitle is that nearly 80% of US adults believe conservation is more important than a speedy renewable energy rollout, our poll finds. That spells trouble for Biden's climate agenda. And it says in Virginia, well, I'm going to skip that part, but it says in Virginia, environmentalists fought a utility scale solar farm that would rank among the largest in the East Coast. It mentions a offshore wind farm in New Jersey, in Utah, Nevada, and even San Francisco Bay Area. Green groups are threatening renewable projects that officials say are crucial to meeting zero carbon goals. And it says, an overwhelming majority of Americans say that conserving local land and wildlife is even more important than building new resources of renewable electricity, even if that slows down the world's response to climate change. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I think that we will. I just don't think we ever hit these targets. I don't think we ever hit we ever even come close. And so we have to deal with the fact that you know, our industrial civilization runs on hydrocarbons, and that they are foundational to civilization. And that you know, the so-called difficult to decarbonize sectors like aviation and maritime shipping are in fact impossible to decarbonize. And so, but we do have opportunities. It doesn't mean we're stuck with the status quo, because we have non-toxic fuels that we can replace them with, fuels that are not gonna, you know, make us sick. They're still greenhouse gases, but then you absorb them, as we're saying, by restoring our ecosystems like crazy. And we just need to get back to, you know, a culture of really growing plants. I mean, it's kind of that simple. We can all do permaculture in our yard, and to start, like, you know, if you've got a yard, so to speak, and just try and clean up the things we can, you know, clean up the litter, clean up the pollution, like just go for the practical wins.
So let me read this. It says the results of the poll offer a warning to the Biden administration. So one thing that I object to is the idea that the Biden administration is serious about doing anything about climate change. You know, the Inside Climate News, the New York Times, these what I consider to be mainstream climate reporters, probably 80 or 90% of them are Democrats, so they have that party loyalty going on. And, you know, as if Joe Biden really cares about the climate, and is as if either of the major parties in Washington, D.C. wants to do anything major, you know, with the climate. You have this Inflation Reduction Act, $367 billion of spending, and you know, we're not changing agriculture, we're not changing transportation, we're not changing defense, we're not changing international trade.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years now they've been having these IPCC meetings, and we haven't reduced emissions one bit. The only thing that's been successful, that everyone would agree has been successful, is swapping out coal for natural gas. That's the only thing that's actually driven any meaningful reductions anywhere in the world. And everything else has been stalled. I mean, they agree to spend money. It's easy to spend money on all these wind turbines and solar panels. That's actually not that hard of a political lift, because as we said, they're just additive anyway to our energy policy or energy demands. But as far as like the hard changes, is like, the reason why they're not getting done is because they're not really possible. Like, it just doesn't actually work. Like, people have such fantasy ideas about how these technologies work. They think that we really can run our planet on wind, solar, and batteries. And it's just, you've got academics producing, you know, completely bogus work. You know, we talked about this guy, Mark Jacobson from Stanford, who's been publishing these 100% renewable energy studies for more than 10 years now. And he's been completely debunked over and over and over again by qualified engineers and qualified scientists. And his response always just to block them on Twitter. He sued this one group and lost, who criticized him. And then he basically never engages with critics, only preaches to the choir. And people like Bill McKibben and other, big time energy activists and will totally quote his work. And they'll say, oh, studies show we can run the world on 100% renewable energy. Every time you hear Bernie Sanders or anybody from the Democratic Party make those kinds of claims, and then you say, all right, well, what studies are you talking about? 90% of the time, they come back to this one guy, Mark Jacobson,
Yeah.
who's publishing completely bogus, fraudulent stuff. And when you go and look at his actual work and what he's actually proposing, the numbers of wind turbines and solar panels that he wants to like just smother the landscape with is completely absurd. Like he only models like these overly sized, super tall turbines that are bigger than anything that's getting built right now, like that are like, incredibly tall, and 100 megawatt solar projects as if they're just like candy. 100 megawatt solar projects is a square mile of land, and he wants them all over the place. And then tens of thousands of turbines all over the place. I mean, it's just completely crazy. And then the biggest lie he makes, well, then he makes a couple big lies. One is he's just completely dismissive about transportation and in heavy industry. He just like waves it away. He's like, we'll just make hydrogen and that solves that problem. Like, whoa. Hydrogen is like it's a grift, man. We're not, the whole green hydrogen thing is a total joke. We go an entire episode on just why green hydrogen is not going to work. Happy to go into it. But the other big argument they make that again is made all the time by the environmental community is that we'll be more efficient, and that by being more efficient with our energy use, we'll drive our aggregate energy use down. This is not true. This is totally not true. It's called Jevons paradox. Making devices more efficient makes us use the energy more, not use energy less, because it makes those devices more desirable to use and people use them more. And we see this all the time. Energy use, we make devices more efficient. We've been doing it since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so they discovered it with coal plants back in the 1800s. They saw that they were being very inefficient with the coal plants. They said, oh, well, we'll reduce our coal use if we make better plants. And so they went from having 4 inefficient, dirty plants to having, like, a couple of years later, 10 highly efficient plants, and they're burning twice as much coal as ever because their plant designs got so good, they just built more plants. We see the same thing with cars. We've been driving fuel efficiency standards for years, for decades now. It hasn't driven down gasoline use, it's driven it up, because which car are you going to drive more? The one that gets 1 mile to the gallon or a car that gets 100 miles to the gallon? Obviously, you can drive the car that gets 100 miles to the gallon, and you're going to drive it like you're like, this car is awesome. Look, I can go to California in 1 tank of gas. You can drive it all over the place. And it goes on and on. LED lighting will be the same thing.
And then with cars, you have, they're always, I have this little thing, highway, building highway. When are we going to build another highway? When are we going to add another lane? So, we're just widening the highways. Go from here to, I drove from here to Chicago recently. It is a dystopian. The view out your window is dystopian. It is highways, cornfields, and wind turbines. They've so ruined the view. There's nothing to see.
And all 3 of those are a function of
industrial
policy.
What?
All 3 of those are a function of policy. All 3 of those are policy driven. The corn market is totally policy driven. Subsidy driven and everything. Our highways are obviously built by the federal government. There's a whole thing with, like, as you add highways, it's very paradoxical. It actually induces more traffic. It doesn't reduce traffic. It just brings more cars in. And people have been learning that now kind of the hard way. Actually, one of my first jobs out of college was in smart highways. We were working doing technology on, the early generation smart highway, easy pass stuff. And I learned that principle back then. Like, traffic studies show that widening lanes does not, otherwise Los Angeles would have great traffic, right? Because they've been widening their lanes forever, but it just makes more cars come in.
Okay, so here's a paragraph in one of the articles by Robinson Meyer. Protecting nature is more important than quickly building renewables, most Americans say. And this paragraph says, this is a quote from Larry Seltzer, president and chief executive of the Conservation Fund, one of the country's largest buyers of conserved land. He says, when you think about renewables, you're talking about an impact on the landscape that is beyond the scale of anything this country has ever seen before. The IRA, that's the Inflation Reduction Act, explicitly contemplates up to 1 million miles of new transmission lines and 65,000 miles of new pipelines. In contrast, the country's last major infrastructure project, the interstate highway system, is about 48,000 miles long, and much of it was built a half century ago. So people don't understand the major scale of this. When you have scale, you have what's proportional to the scale, and that is energy and pollution and the use of materials and a commitment to a high energy transportation system and a high energy system that requires a whole lot of infrastructure just to operate.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a fragile system, deeply interconnected, tied, coast to coast and internationally on supply chains. It is not like a redundant or resilient system, really. It would, a shock could really break it, and supply chain issues are a real problem. Adding to what he was saying, like I've read through a lot of these studies on the land use impacts, and you see all sorts of different estimates of like how much solar is realistic and how does it compare to like agriculture. And these numbers, I should pull up some of these studies. Because you see a guy like Elon Musk make a claim that, a 2,000 square mile, array of solar panels, 2,000 miles on they could fit up in the panhandle of Texas or something would, give enough electricity for the whole country. And it's like, these are totally specious claims. I mean, not only does the engineering not work, but like, we just can't like build that kind of stuff. I don't know. Like, and as you spread these projects out, I mean, there is a lot of room. I mean, it's not that we don't have any room to do any, and I don't want to be like, I think that we can build a lot of solar, and solar is extremely useful. And I do advocate for a high energy future. I think that might be a place where you and I aren't on the same page, because I'm all for like Star Trek, Star Wars future. I'm like, let's go to outer space and let's like keep pushing the envelope forward. But, either we figure out how to way to do it ecologically or we fail. And it's a binary option, either like figure out ecology or don't. But I don't think we can go backwards on the Industrial Revolution.
So here's one of my objections to how this information is presented. And it is that, okay, if you put the label solar on it, then it is ipso facto clean, green, and renewable. If you call it wind, then it's clean, green, and renewable. Anything that is classified as renewable qualifies for these major tax credits and giveaways and subsidies and relief from regulations. If it's, clear cutting a forest and taking the trees, turning them into wood chips, shipping them to Europe and burning them in the Drax power plant, which used to be a coal plant, and now it's burning American trees.
Right.
Then that's classified as renewable. It helps meet certain requirements of the European Union, and the United States is not pushing back on it. It's not placing limits on that kind of thing, but because it's classified as clean and renewable, then it gets a pass.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Biomass energy is that was the first one that I really studied and kind of got my head around of all the different technologies. And the one lesson I learned early on was from a guy named Professor Pimentel, Robert Pimentel, I think is his name, at Cornell. He's an old ethanol guy. I'm pretty sure he's retired by now, but he was an ethanol expert. And he made the point that biofuels will never replace fossil fuels for the sheer reason of scale. That if you cut down all of agriculture, if you dedicated 100% of our agriculture to fuel crops, which you obviously wouldn't do, it would still be a drop in the bucket of our aggregate, gasoline and diesel use. And that is if we dedicated 100% of agriculture. Even if we took all of our global greenery, stripped the entire planet bare of vegetation, it would still not be more than our annual use of hydrocarbons, of fossil fuels. Kind of making that number up, but but you get the idea. Like the number, they don't scale. The biofuels don't scale, and then there's other problems with biofuels too, which is that you put energy into them to grow them and harvest them, and then when they come out of the ground, they're like 70% water. So then you've got to harvest them, transport them, convert them into another fuel product. You're putting so much energy into it that it's barely an energy resource when it comes out. Corn ethanol is literally not an energy resource. It is a 1.1 to 1. There's as much energy has gone into that corn ethanol as comes out of it when you burn it in your vehicle. It's not an energy resource at all. It's simply a giveaway to corn farmers. But that basic idea is true whether it's wood, whether it's garbage. I mean, they have a rule of thumb that you can't really transport stuff more than 100 miles because you're just driving water around. So you've got to process it someplace close by. And then it just doesn't scale anyway.
Now, let's talk about, just while we're talking about biomass. So most biomass, biomass usually means trees and wood. It could mean anything. It means life mass.
Anything green.
But it usually means we've clear cut a forest. Now, forests don't recover from being clear cut. The idea is that if you cut the forest and burn it, then, well, it's going to grow back. And when it grows back, it's going to absorb carbon. But that's like taking all the money out of your savings account and saying, well, it'll just be put back in there. But more to the point, if you clear cut a forest, then the soil immediately begins to degrade. For one thing, you've eliminated the habitat for how many living animals and ecosystems that, when they're intact, they do absorb carbon and absorb water and are helpful to local water cycles. But when you remove them, then you have all this carbon being released into the air after the clear cut, because that carbon rich soil is not going to be carbon rich anymore because the ecosystem that it grew in is now gone.
And it stops the transpiration, as we were talking about before. It stops bringing the water into the ground and restoring the aquifers, and so then your creeks dry up and your aquifers dry up. And it's just this cascade of failures. So yes, those forests would be far more valuable to us as ongoing carbon capture and ongoing wildlife habitat than to be burned down for fuel. Another point on the same lines is that, we've had deforestation pre-industry, without industry. Poor people have routinely deforested their regions just for local domestic use of timber and firewood. We had all through the Middle Ages, much of Europe was deforested back in the 1500s and 1600s. That's what drove them to start burning coal in the first place, was because they'd run out of wood. And that was pre-industry. And so now if you want to start throwing industry at the problem, we'll just deforest everything like crazy. And it just doesn't scale. Again, it just doesn't scale.
This article says, although the Inflation Reduction Act contains at least $25 billion to support conservation programs on agricultural and forestry land, this has not attracted as much attention as clean energy programs. So I think $25 billion for conservation on forested land and agricultural land is a drop in the bucket. If they really wanted to do something good for the environment, then take away the subsidies that encourage the worst practices. The crop insurance programs require, you have to have a monoculture. There's not very much in it. That they subsidize monocultures and tillage and herbicides and pesticides and genetically modified crops, all of which makes the landscape, the farmscape, into a food desert for wildlife. There's nothing there for bees, butterflies, birds, any other kind of wildlife. Plus, they're using pesticides like neonicotinoids, which are terribly toxic. They're using herbicides to get rid of all the weeds, which are otherwise known as wildflowers. We could have biologically diverse farms that are wildlife habitat if we removed these artificial subsidies. And that is what farmers are saying. David Montgomery reports that farmers are saying, remove these subsidies and we'll get to a more rational place and have biologically diverse farms that are good for wildlife, good for water quality, good for climate.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our the economic practices are policy driven. And one thing I'll say about the policies is that, coming out of World War II, in the 40s and 50s, the big concern in those days, no one was concerned about the environment. The big concern in those days was famine. And that was a real problem. Like, that was like no joke. There was a lot of people that were starving around the world. And so they set about the farmers, the scientists, the policymakers, big business. They set about to figure out a way to drive up yields and feed the people. And God bless them, they succeeded at it. They just didn't realize all these other problems they were going to create. But they succeeded in, achieving those goals that were set back in the 50s and 60s. They achieved in spades. They blew Paul Ehrlich's, population bomb thesis out of the water. But now we created all these new problems and that nobody was anticipating. So now we got to solve this new set of problems. Like, we just, humans, we just lurch from one crisis to the next, one problem to the next, just try to solve one thing at a time. So I'm actually pretty hopeful. Actually, I think we can solve a lot of the problems. I just think there's a lot of near-term political problems. I mean, obviously big ag is going to resist these changes like crazy unless they are getting their beaks wet too, so that is, that's a challenge, and it's tough.
So when you say big ag, it's the agribusiness corporations. It's not the farmers
Oh
that
yeah, I
are
agree.
standing in the way of positive change. We conflate, we allow these big ag corporations to speak for farmers as if they're the ones with a straw hat and coveralls,
Right.
driving the tractor. But it's the agribusiness corporations are taking all of the profits out of the industry. Millions of farmers, probably farmers by the hundreds of thousands per year, go out of business. And I've seen this graph. Christine Jones shows this graph of Canadian farm income. It's like, here's all the income from the early part of the 20th century to the later part of the 20th century. Revenue from farming goes up, 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 but farm profits keeps going down, and farm profits are kind of in the red. And so all
And do you
this
know at what point
increasing
that
amount of
shifted? Like, at
revenue
what
in
point, at
farming,
what
but
point,
it's not being enjoyed by the farmers themselves.
at what point in the 20th century did that really start to change? Do you think that I mean, farming's always been a tough business and people have always been on the poorer side, but at some point, like in the late 20th century, it really flipped that even your good farmers are really, really struggling. Um, I'm not sure when that happened, in the 60s or 70s,
Well,
around there.
let me just, as I recall from this graph, it was in the 70s when there was a big shift. I know in the 70s, that's when Wendell Berry wrote his book, The Unsettling of America, which was primarily a critique of agricultural policy. The Secretary of Agriculture at the time was a man named Earl Butz, who told farmers, get big or get out. And that was because of the capital requirements of farming that they imposed. They also said plow fence row to fence row. They also said food is a weapon. And but farms are getting bigger. And the only way for farms to get bigger is for farmers to go out of business. And you have the US big time started playing games with agricultural exports on the worldwide markets. They wanted leverage over every other country in the world, not least of all Russia and China. So it was this foreign policy gamesmanship that was going on, and the needs and wants and desires and the legitimate needs of farmers were just irrelevant.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I really think this is where I'd like to see the environmental movement move in this direction, away from the technology fetish and back to an ecology fetish. The technology's got to come second. The technology's got to come in support of the ecology. I mean, a point I wanted to make earlier was that, all these bad farm practices is in part rooted in a spiritual problem, in our spiritual separation from nature. And we've been separate from nature, culturally speaking, for a long time now. It's rooted in biblical traditions and Enlightenment traditions, doubled down on it. I mean, the Enlightenment thinkers really saw us as being totally separate from nature. And so we've been at it for some time now, and it's catching up to bite us. And we got to get those spiritual renewal that imbues us culturally with the values, and from the values we come up with the methods, and then the laws, and then the policies come last. The technology and policy and all that stuff needs to come downstream from a culture shift and a values shift and a spiritual shift, and really put the land first, and put the wildlife first, and recognize that we are part of nature, and if all the animals die, then we're next. We got to figure it out.
Well, Ed, don't you know that if we do that, it's going to be bad for the economy?
It's going to be bad for the economy one of these days.
I disagree with that, by the way.
I do too. I think that there's, yes, short-term business models could be challenged, but the economy is totally a variable and dynamic place, and there's lots of different ways to live. And it's a
Well,
question of what do we value?
the economy, such as it is now, favors a very few people.
Right.
So if the purpose of an economy, for the sake of discussion, if we said the purpose of the economy is to optimize the wealth of people, and if people are interpreted to mean the majority or the vast majority of people, we wouldn't have the economy that we have now, because arguably the economy such as it is now serves to extract wealth from the great majority and give it to the small minority.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the oligarchy at the top is definitely conspiring. I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theories, but it doesn't take a genius to recognize that the rich folks hang out with the rich folks and do everything possible to keep on getting richer, and, and keep it in the club. So, and they will resist, they will resist anything that wants to change it, because, everybody resists change when they're comfortable with the status quo. But the nature stuff is going to bite us at one of these days. It really is going to catch up to us, and something's going to break. I don't know when, and I don't know what, and I'm not clairvoyant, so I have no idea. We could keep chunking along, flailing along for some time now. Like, it's not like, I don't buy the notion that we're going to like mass extinction in 10 years from now.
Well, even if there's not one big catastrophic event or these planetary boundaries, I don't know enough to know if but whenever something is measured on a planetary scale, to me, I just think the more relevant thing is the local and regional analysis. Plus, if we have to breathe, eat, and drink poison on an increasing basis, then that should be a sign that we're going in the wrong direction. If species are going extinct locally, then that's a problem, because it's a mistake to think that the only thing that matters is whether a species goes extinct worldwide. If a species is native to my area but does not exist there, then it is extinct in my area, and it is functionally extinct in my area, is no longer performing its function. And that's relevant, because every species, if you think about it, every species evolved in such a way as to benefit its environment. That is the overarching tendency. Humans are an exception to that. We got past that to where we can survive even if we're destroying our environment, at least for now. But most species, by definition, a successful species like blue jays, they bury acorns, and they bury like 3 times more than they eat. So they are planting oak trees. And if you live off acorns, it's smart to plant more oak trees, to plant more acorns than you can eat. So so there's that.
Yeah, yeah, and we've got to be the same way. And I'm always reminded of this. I used to work in IT, and so I did a lot of computer support for folks. And you could tell people till you're blue in the face to do backups of their data and do their security on everything on their computers. And you tell people this stuff, and they say, yeah, yeah, yeah. But inevitably, every computer user, I think this is pretty much true of everybody, every computer user at some point in their life has the experience of a catastrophic data loss where their computer crashes and they lost everything and it wasn't recoverable and they didn't have it backed up. And at some point, everybody learns this hard lesson. And I've had some people to have some take it on the chin a few times. I've had some users who are like, my entire thesis, my entire grad school, all of my research for 3 years is on that laptop. My entire collection of lifetime collection of photographs on that laptop. I say, and you didn't have any backups anywhere on that piece of junk you handed me? And you'll see that their eyes light up and their jaw drop and like, you can't get it back. It's really all gone. Like, yeah, I'm sorry. And you see that same person a year later and you say, oh, how's it going? Like, yeah, I do my backups now. And so we always said that, like, we had an expression about it that people would get religion about their backups after a catastrophic data loss. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think we're going to have some kind of breakdown that's fairly traumatic and that will scare people, and it will scare people to like get religion about ecology and learn that at a core value, we have to put ecology on the same level as we put human rights, basically. Because right now we have human rights above economic rights, and then economic rights trumps everything else. Economic rights totally trumps ecology, the way our culture is established right now. But we need to elevate ecology above economics, or at least recognize that our economics have to be bound by ecology.
We have a couple minutes left. Why don't you're doing a great job of kind of bringing it back to the big picture. So what are Ed Dodge's core values and insights that you would like to leave us with?
Well, I have 3 principles. If I could wave a magic wand and write all the policy rules myself, I would follow 3 principles towards a sustainable industrial civilization. The first one would be restore ecosystems. Rule number 1, restore ecosystems like crazy. Permaculture, regenerative agriculture, reforesting, the whole 9 yards, all of it. We have to get the wildlife biodiversity back, all of it. Rule number 2, mimic nature and model nature with our economy and industry. So that means a circular economy and zero waste, which I view as 2 sides of a coin. So we just can't be allowed to have pollution. Every industry, not just energy, every industry needs to have a full accounting of where their molecules end up. Pharmaceuticals, paper making, clothes, anything, computers, high tech, everybody needs to be held to account. And if your molecules that you're putting out there into the world are not, if they're fine for nature, then they can go out into nature. But if they're not going to be good for nature, then that industry has to be held responsible for collecting those materials back up and doing something appropriate with them, recycling them or what have you. And so that's a whole discussion unto itself. And then my third principle is clean fuels. There is no path to decarbonizing our economy, but we can detoxify our economy. We can swap out the toxic fuels, the ones that actually make us sick, the coal, the diesel fuel. We can swap all of them out today with proven technologies of non-toxic replacement. So methane, dimethyl ether, DME, and other synthetic fuels that are available today and proven at industrial scale and cost effective. We can be replacing diesel fuel right now and clean up our air emissions right now. And we're wasting time thinking we're going to electrify all of our big rig diesel engines when we could be swapping them out for something non-toxic today. And so those would be my 3 principles: restore ecosystems, zero waste, and clean fuels.
That's a great place to end. Thank you, Ed Dodge, for joining me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Hart. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome.